There's one card that I've truthfully kind of been dancing around talking about ever since I started playing Yu-Gi-Oh! It is obviously something that is very controversial and causes a number of discussions in the community. And even when I made my video about cards that I thought were important for trading card games, needed to exist, even though they were at times pretty frustrating. I specifically didn't talk about this card for a couple of reasons. One of them being I didn't feel like I had enough time to really form an opinion about it. And two, I'm not sure it's good for this game. So the card that I'm talking about, you saw it in the thumbnail already, obviously, is Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. It is a uh, integral part to modern Yu-Gi-Oh, released almost 10 years ago at this point. And coming into the game as a newcomer now, it's kind of something that you just take for granted that it is a card you play. And I think for the last 10 years, that's been true too. It is a 3 of in every deck. You just start your deck building process with 3 Ash Blossom, except in some like very niche circumstances. There are occasionally decks who don't play it, but generally speaking, it appears in everything. And Ash Blossom is a really interesting card. The concept behind it is that it exists as this important answer when going second. So Ash Blossom is a hand trap that allows you to negate a variety of things, adding things to hand, sending things to graveyard are kind of the two big ones that come up the most often, but also special summoning from deck it can prevent as well, I believe. And what's particularly important about Ash Blossom is that when it was designed, it was intended to provide players going second the capacity to slow down or interact with their opponents uh, in a way that would basically reduce the power level of their ultimate end board. And I think contextually, this is a little bit more a little bit stranger now because in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And like obviously the entire time that I've been playing, the prevalence of one card starters that don't require the normal summon have made it so that the efficacy of Ash Blossom is lower and it's less about now finding the right point in your opponent's line to fire off the Ash. And a lot of the times it's just deciding which thing you think you might win, that you might be able to actually meaningfully constrict their combo by ashing, but at the same time it's not going to completely break your opponent's turn. Ash Blossom's a really interesting card, and I wanted to talk about it in a couple of different ways. The first one is I wanted to try and find some parallels for it in other trading card games, and I did some looking around. I have one really obvious one that people talk about in Magic that I'll talk about in a minute. I think that parallel is interesting, but not so much in the fact that the effects of the card are similar, but the metagame pressure that the cards exert is similar. And I want to talk about that. So, what is the metagame pressure that Ash Blossom exerts, and what is metagame pressure? That's really what this video is going to be about. So the idea of metagame pressure is that the existence of single cards or sometimes collections of cards make it so that certain things are not really viable to do in particular metagames, or certain things are particularly important and valuable to do in a metagame. So what are the kinds of metagame pressure that Ash Blossom exerts? Notably, number one, it makes it so that you are really incentivized to have either a combo that does not have one like linchpin point in it, where if it gets ashed, you get nothing. You're incentivized to play extenders. You're incentivized to maybe try and make sure that your deck has multiple pushes so that a single ash doesn't completely break your turn, especially if you're going first. That's metagame pressure number one that it exerts. Metagame pressure number two, though, that it exerts is that it in some ways has this kind of check and balance that it creates on playing the other frustrating lingering hand traps. So Ash Blossom is one of the best ways to actually interact with getting Charmied, like having it's one of the few ways that you can consistently deal with a Mulcharmy Fulos. And that's a modern metagame pressure that has developed. It's a new reason why you basically want to start every deck building process with 3 Ash Blossom, because the Charmies are so prevalent. The discussion about which of those things is a good thing and which of those things is a bad thing is actually really complicated. You will hear arguments from both sides. People saying that the Charmies shouldn't exist, and so Ash Blossom existing to be able to counter the Charmies is very important. And then you'll also have people on the other side of the fence saying, Charmies do need to exist, and Ash Blossom's existence as a way to counter the Charmies going first is a bad thing. And I'll talk about where I land on that at the end of the video. We'll give my final verdict then. But these are the metagame pressures that Ash Blossom exerts. It makes the Charmies worse, not so much worse that you're not going to play them, but it does make them worse, which is a relevant metagame pressure. And it also exerts this metagame pressure where decks that are trying to combo a lot of the times need to be built more robustly. Lastly, there's kind of an interesting, this isn't metagame pressure, but there's a development pressure or design pressure that seems to be exerted by Ash Blossom on Konami. One thing that I've noticed in my time playing is that many of the modern archetypes that Konami has designed are designed with a lot of intentionality given to what they are willing to expose to Ash Blossom. And so you're seeing more and more cards that are templated in a way where they set cards directly, set spells or traps directly, rather than adding them to your hand. And that's relevant because that gets around Ash Blossom. Or you'll have things that get sent to graveyard or get sent to banishment and are then returned from those locations, meaning that once again, they are not opened up to being targetable by Ash Blossom. And I think that that is also something that is worth exploring, this idea that Konami printed this exceptionally powerful interactive tool, and that interactive tool's metagame pressure is such that in order to make it so that archetypes feel playable, you have to give them some kind of built-in resilience to Ash, and that built-in resilience usually looks like providing some amount of combo line that doesn't get exposed to Ash in any way. It's interesting, and I think that when you're talking about Ash Blossom and you're talking about the metagame pressure, those are the things you need to think about. Charmies, combo, like basically like robustness, I guess we'll say. And then there's also this like less metagame, but this design pressure of making it so the cards are not necessarily exposed now. So what are some other cards in other card games that exert similar metagame pressures? Maybe we can use some of those to try and evaluate whether the metagame pressure exerted by Ash Blossom is a good or a bad thing. So the card that I always see Ash Blossom compared to by people who play both Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! Is Force of Will. Force of Will is the pitch cast counterspell that is most prevalent in Legacy, the Legacy format, which is not quite the most analogous to Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic. Vintage is probably closer in terms of the speed and the kind of viciousness with which decks are able to end the game, but Legacy is also a high power format. As a side note, if you are a Yu-Gi-Oh! Player who is interested in getting into Magic but wants to play something that is higher power level and not quite as plodding as maybe like Standard or Modern even, I would recommend Legacy. There's lots of very powerful, fun things to do in that format. So Force of Will is pretty different from Ash Blossom in a variety of ways, though. So importantly, Force of Will, you have to pitch another blue card from your hand in order to cast it. You have to pay a life, which doesn't come up until it does, interestingly enough. Like, the one life feels trivial, and then you'll get into these games where you force twice, and all of a sudden it swings the race, and you're like, oh my god, maybe I didn't need to Force of Will this card. But Force of Will's existence in Legacy is pretty different in some ways and pretty similar in others to Ash Blossom. So obviously the obvious comparison that people look at right away is that these are both pieces of interaction that are free and that are relatively ubiquitous. Blue decks in Legacy and Vintage are playing Force of Will with very few exceptions. And the metagame pressure that Force of Will exists is that it kind of requires your combo decks to be either robust or it forces them to have multiple pushes. So you either need to play a combo deck that is going to have some form of interaction before it goes for the win, either through forms of like Thoughtseize. Maybe you're playing Force of Wills of your own in the case of like Show and Tell and Sneak Attack. Or you need to be able to present multiple wins, and that's something that, say, like the current Oops All Spells deck does in Legacy, where it puts a spy on the stack, and you Force of Will it, and then it casts Reanimate, targeting that spy, which threatens another win right away. So Force of Will is doing similar things to Ash Blossom in its combo and in its kind of like attempts to restrict degeneracy. Kind of. It is also doing similar things to Ash Blossom in the sense that it can be used defensively in a way that sometimes becomes problematic, actually. The times where Force of Will has felt most objectionable in a lot of cases have been when it's being able to be used in these kind of like proactive decks that are actually using it to defend their own combo. A lot of the times that's actually the spot where Force of Will feels the most unfair, is when it's being used to protect a win as opposed to defend against one. And I think that that's actually where the comparisons stop. Importantly, Force of Will does not have the same impacts as Ash Blossom in that it cannot do anything once your opponent has put something onto the board. So one of the things that it doesn't come up that often now because of the speed of Yu-Gi-Oh games, but it is relevant that once a monster or like a continuous spell is on the field and is being activated, like you can still Ash it, which is very different from Force of Will, which is very all or nothing. The counterplay for Force of Will is also relatively different. We have just this concept of uncounterability in Magic, where there are often decks that are using things like, say, like Boseiju or Cavern of Souls, which are lands that let you generate mana that make your spells uncounterable. These are ways to force through things through Force of Will that aren't obviously existent in Yu-Gi-Oh! In Yu-Gi-Oh! You have to instead go for templating changes to make sure that cards dodge Ash. So Force is an interesting comparison. It is worse. I think Ash Blossom is actually a stronger card than Force of Will. But is Force of Will's metagame pressure good or bad? And I think that if you ask any Legacy player, well, maybe not literally any Legacy player, but if you ask most Legacy players, the existence of Force of Will is a good thing. It is putting the kind of pressure on the format where you are incentivized to at least make some concessions in your deck building process about whether or not you can beat Force. You don't really want to live in a world where there is not this kind of like turn zero interaction in Legacy, because there are the capacity to build decks that really would just degenerately try and win the game on turn one. And because those decks have to make some amount of concessions to beating Force of Will, the format is better for it. I think a pretty good example of this is something that I've brought up already. The Oops All Spells deck, or the Spy deck, is a really cool deck. I like it. I'm a degenerate Spy player. I think it's fun. And the way that this combo works is that you play Balustrade Spy, which is a 4-mana creature. It was actually printed as like a nothing kind of common and uncommon cycle in a Ravnica set, in Return to Ravnica. And it was intended to just be like this mill card where you would mill until you hit a land. So maybe you would like mill your opponent for 4 if you really high rolled. But what people realized in Legacy 10 years ago, like even longer, in like 2015 when this set came out, 2014 when this set came out, is that if you just didn't put lands in your deck and you were able to target yourself with either Balustrade Spy or Undercity Informer, you could just deck yourself. And in Legacy, at least, if you can deck yourself, you can win the game. So what this meant is that in early days, you had to basically play all of the free mana you could possibly access. And it meant that there wasn't really space in the deck after the combo, the spies, the free mana. You couldn't really fit room for additional anti-combo cards. Maybe you could play like exactly Duress or Thoughtseize to prevent Force of Will from getting you. But Spy existed for a long time as this deck that really was very all-in, and you would beat people who didn't have turn zero interaction like Force of Will. But so much of the format was playing Force of Will that Spy was kept in check. Recently, though, because Wizards has printed a bunch of these multi-faced dual land cards, I don't think that's MDFC. I'm getting the initialism wrong again. I always get it wrong. I'm not even going to try again. But because Wizards has printed a bunch of these lands that are spells on one side, and then if you flip them, they are lands, it has created this somewhat weird problem where now, because these cards count as spells when you are milling for Spy, you get to play lands in your Spy deck. And so the Spy decks have been allowed to decrease the amount of fast mana and free mana that they've needed to play, and instead are now just decks with lands dark rituals to make extra mana, like lotus petals to make extra mana, but then they just get to play Thoughtseize and reanimate to go again. And it has really generated like a pretty negative play experience. Like I personally would love to see something in the spy deck hit. I do think that it is too powerful and you don't want a deck like this being that strong in the format. And I think that it is a testament that it took that deck becoming robust to become problematic. When it was just fast and it was just trying to mulligan into a turn one kill every game, Force of Will was able to keep it in check. And now that Force of Will is not able to keep it in check because it has exceeded that metagame pressure, I do think there's an argument that it is decidedly too good and probably requires a change of some sort. So, I would say on average that the metagame pressure of Force of Will is good. And you can play around Force of Will, importantly, as well. There are lots of ways to play decks that are actively very good into Force of Will, either by leveraging things like I mentioned, like Cavern of Souls that let you play straight through the Force of Will, or just playing cards that don't really care about the fact that your opponent is 2-for-1ing themselves to counter something. If you just put well, it's banned now, I guess, but if you put a White Plume Adventurer on the stack and your opponent Force of Wills it, well, you just 2-for-1 them and you're probably not that unhappy about it. They banned that one because it was too good, but Seasoned Dungeoneer, let's say that one instead. That one's still legal. If you put a Seasoned Dungeoneer on the stack and they Force of Will it, you're often not that upset about that because the game is going to go long. They just 2-for-1 themselves and you're going to win the game. So it's not like Force of Will is this completely restricting piece of technology, but it does keep the right things down. And the question is, does Ash Blossom do the same thing? I think it used to. I think there's maybe an argument that it's not doing that anymore. Let's talk about another card in the Magic context. This one is more of a card that I see played in Modern, and it's also one that is it kind of creates metagame pressure in one of my favorite formats, Canadian Highlander. And this is Orcish Bowmaster. So this is a 2-mana creature with flash. It pings for a damage when it enters. And then anytime your opponent draws a card, other than their card for their draw step, it pings. And also it makes a 1/1 that slowly gets bigger as you ping it. As you ping, you get to amass, which makes this creature larger. So in Legacy, the pressure, there isn't like super prevalent metagame pressure from Orcish Bowmaster. It does still exist. Like what I'm going to talk about is true there as well. But I just talked about Legacy extensively, so I'm going to talk about Modern as well in this particular spot. Liam from the future here, I wanted to further clarify that there is metagame pressure exerted on the Legacy format by Orcish Bowmasters. I'm not saying that it does not. Obviously, it's like a 4 of in the most popular deck. It's very important. It makes cantrips way worse in a lot of ways. Card is very powerful, but I wanted to talk about the Modern implications more than the Legacy ones. But it is obviously a super powerful Legacy card and has massive metagame pressure in that format as well. And the metagame pressure that Orcish Bowmaster being playable exerts is that it makes playing creatures with 1 toughness extremely bad. Basically, if you play a 1-drop that does nothing and has 1 toughness, and your opponent untaps and plays Orcish Bowmasters and kills it largely for free, you are often in a really, really poor spot in the game. And so as a result, you're really incentivized to play 1 toughness creatures with a super high bar for power level. You still see cards like Ocelot Pride seeing play in both Modern and Legacy. Because if they live, they just are so effective and they are really just so powerful. And so those ones kind of get a pass. Cards like Ragavan are the same, where again, if it lives, it's just so powerful that it's worth taking the risk on. But outside of that, it has become incredibly challenging to justify registering X1 creatures with 1 toughness. And that has created the same kind of design pressure that Ash Blossom has. It's pretty obvious that Wizards has identified that 1 toughness is now a breakpoint where they can use that to either try to curtail power of a card that they think they've put quite a strong text box on, or if they want to make sure that a card might see play, they can do something like give the 1-drop or even the 2-drop a second point of toughness so that it is out of Orcish Bowmasters range. Orcish Bowmasters is, again, I think, an example of mostly positive metagame pressure. It doesn't have quite the same kind of format police vibes as Force of Will does. The punishing of drawing cards is a little bit more weird because lots of decks want to draw cards incidentally for both like nefarious and just unnefarious gameplay reasons. And so I do think that this is a card that's a bit more like frustrating to have around, and I could see arguments for its metagame pressure being negative. But for now, I think that it's largely agreed upon that the metagame pressure of Orcish Bowmasters is fine. I don't think a lot of people feel like especially positive or especially negative on it. It's made decks like Elves more challenging to register, but then they've also just started to print more Elves with 2 toughness. So it's been kind of a back and forth in that regard. And in the same way, like the metagame pressure that Force of Will and Orcish Bowmasters exert is mostly just something that causes the evolution of the format, as opposed to really being like super prescriptive and really negative. I think even if you did like remove Orcish Bowmasters, it's not as though the format would immediately fall into disrepair and become in an imbalanced state. You would see metagame changes, but it would be fine either way. This card could be legal or it could not be legal. Unlike Force of Will, which I think very much so needs to be legal. So those are 2 examples of cards that I think have reasonable and in some cases actively very good metagame pressure. But there are cards that don't. There are cards that exert negative metagame pressure, and I'm going to talk about a few of them now. So in current Star Wars Unlimited, there's a card that's exerting really negative metagame pressure. I tried to make a video about this entirely, and I just kept getting angry when I was making it, so I scrapped the whole thing. But I played a showdown last weekend for Star Wars Unlimited. It was lots of fun. I lost in the finals, and I lost to the same person twice also. And it really did get me thinking about this card. So in the new Star Wars Unlimited metagame, they banned a lot, or they didn't ban, they rotated out a lot of the high quality removal. And so as a result, the goal was to make it so that playing units was good and that there would be lots of unit combat where it was important to try and fight for control of the board and make decisions about whether you were going to push damage towards your opponent's base or trade off with their units and really set things up. And unfortunately, that has not been the overall metagame that has developed as a result of the rotation. The main thing that has happened is that Boba Fett Lake Country, another Fett in the line of broken Boba Fett leaders in Star Wars Unlimited's history, has really taken over the meta in terms of play rate. There are obviously other decks being played. It's not like a tier 0 format yet, although I do think it is likely that they will make some kind of change. And a big reason for why Boba Fett feels so frustrating to play against and why I think he's exerting really negative metagame pressure is Topple the Summit. So Topple the Summit is an event, basically think spell in Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh, that you can play at the same time as deploying your leader. It has what's called plot. And so this is important because this is a form of what we call in Star Wars Unlimited action compression. Typically, Star Wars Unlimited is you go, I go, and when you get to plot something out at the same time as deploying your leader, you're actually getting to take 2 actions when you would normally only be getting 1. So it's powerful to action compress. And Topple the Summit is particularly powerful in the context of the Boba Fett deck because Boba Fett says when you deploy me as a pilot, you can play him on a ship. If you deploy him on a space unit, you get to deal 4 damage, divided how you would like amongst your opponent's units, and then you can play Topple the Summit, which deals 3 damage to each damaged unit. And what this means is that on the 6 resource turn, you are basically in a spot where if the Boba Fett player is able to deploy Boba onto a ship, you are likely losing your whole board. It's very challenging to set up boards that are capable of surviving a Boba Topple the Summit play. And it means that you are almost always going into this turn where your opponent deploys Boba, they make a large ship in space, and they wipe your board. And they oftentimes still have something of their own besides that. And so the metagame pressure here is particularly negative because, in my mind at least, it makes it so that you are really incentivized to kind of not play units, which is clearly not what the goal of this particular design cycle was, right? The intention behind this rotation was to hopefully create a metagame where combat math mattered and you were doing more unit versus unit combat, playing sentinels, trying to set up blockers, things like that. And Boba really invalidates a lot of those things that they were clearly trying to go for. Additionally, there's a second metagame pressure being exerted by Cinta Kaz, another plot card. This is a 6-mana 5/5 with plot that when you play it, you get to attack with a unit right away. And so this is also exerting similar metagame pressure in the sense that what it's doing is that it's making it so that in the Boba deck, but in other pilot decks as well, when you deploy your leader as a pilot on a ship, you can, if you are ahead and winning the race, and you have both Topple and Cinta in your resource row to play, if you're winning the race, you just deploy Boba, probably kill something still, because it does deal 4 damage. You play Cinta, you attack with Boba, you get in for like 9 or 10 damage. And then a lot of the time, your opponent is in a situation where if they can't literally kill the ship with Boba in it, like that turn, they're probably losing the game because they just can't beat you in the race. Or if you are behind on board, you play Topple the Summit, you wrath their board, and you once again, you're ahead. And so the metagame pressure here is really problematic because there's also not quality removal. There are not decks that exist that can just opt out of this duality and just decide, I'm just going to try and kill everything that you play and not develop units of my own until after this leader flip turn. You don't have that choice currently. And in particular, there's not good removal for piloted ships when the pilot is a leader. There's no way to just get both. You can destroy the leader as an upgrade relatively cheaply, but removing both the ship and the pilot relatively challenging. And the metagame pressure here is pretty obvious and is pretty obviously negative. It has resulted in the only real viable ways to play the game to be to go extremely fast. You have a lot of aggro decks represented. But even with that, you're still seeing Boba win a lot of tournaments, in part because the base that Boba gets to play is Lake Country, which has 34 HP. So you're also just generally advantaged in racing situations. You're starting the game with 4 extra health. So there's a bunch of things going on. I think it's very likely that after the sector qualifiers coming up, that something changes in this metagame, because the metagame pressure that's being exerted is creating a situation that is not a positive one. And I think that there's an argument for this being the case that we have with Ash Blossom now, where we have this metagame where you are forced to play Ash Blossoms because you need them to counter Charmies, and that's not necessarily great, I think. So we'll talk about that more at the end, but that's an example of really negative metagame pressure. Another one that I'll talk about quickly is Draven in Riftbound, the leader. Obviously, big sweeping bans came into place. They removed a lot of the cards that made that deck tick, but it is still a leader that is popping up in tournaments. And a big part of the reason why is that Draven creates this metagame pressure where you're not allowed to lose combats, which is kind of like a weird thing to say, but many of the cards in Riftbound are designed around being tricky and jumping out of combat so that you can save your own unit. And those kinds of cards and effects are just not registerable in a world where Draven is a playable deck. And in the same vein, it's also not super viable to be registering decks that are planning to throw units away to take battlefields. Something like, say, like Lilia, which is a deck that has seen a bit more play recently, is something that is looking to, or that it is going to see a bit more play once it's actually playable in North America, is a deck that's looking to just put 3/3 temporary sprites into battlefields. And with Draven still playable, I think you're oftentimes just going to be feeding Draven free cards off of the combats. And so that's another example of, I think, negative metagame pressure. I think that there's a real decent argument that they should have just banned Draven. It's being clawed in the leg. Hello, Mabel. You love the morning recording sessions. Would you like some cat ASMR? I think we heard her a little bit. Yeah, so I think that there's a real argument that the Draven metagame pressure isn't good and that it is negative in the same way. So Lastly, let's talk about the cards I've kind of been alluding to throughout this video, because I do think it's relevant to talk about them. I already made a video talking about the Charmies and about the fact that I think that they are probably frustrating but currently important. And there was a lot of dialogue on that video, which I love, by the way. I really like that the comment sections of basically all my videos are full of people having conversations about their opinions about card games. And overall, I think everyone does a really good job of being like passionate but respectful. So thank you so much to everyone for doing that. I really like reading the comments. I try to engage with many of this as I can. And one thing that I had certainly missed when discussing the Charmies that I thought someone brought up. I'll try and get a screenshot of the comment, and I can't remember your username, I'm sorry, but there's this great comment that someone made where they talked about the fact that Charmies have kind of created a caste system of sorts in deck archetypes, where your deck either slots into being a modern deck that has been designed with Charmies in mind, and as a result is capable of playing the game under a Charmy, or your deck is from the older generation and is not designed with Charmies in mind and doesn't fully fold to one, but basically can't create its end board without giving 4 or 5 Charmy draws a lot of the time. And I thought that that was a really important point, and something that I had kind of missed out on, is that there is this similar kind of design pressure that I've been talking about with Ash Blossom, that I've been talking about with other things, that exists with Charmies as well. And this is certainly something that comes up a lot with Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically, because the format is eternal, because the format allows for all cards to always be played. It does create this requirement on Konami's part where if they're trying to print cards directly into this already quite high power level format, they have to find design reasons to make you want to do that. And obviously making it so that your archetype can play through a Charmy or an Ash Blossom is one of those things. But the big thing about Charmies, and one of the things I saw people saying pretty often, is, oh, Charmies should never resolve, or Charmies should always resolve. And this, I think, gets to the core of the Ash Blossom conversation. So let's talk about it. Does Ash Blossom exert positive or negative metagame pressure? Is the card good or bad for the game broadly? I think that if you look at Ash as purely a reactive card, it is arguably a positive metagame pressure. It forces decks to be built more robustly. It forces you to look for more extenders potentially. And overall, that's likely a good thing. However, there are multiple competing factors that make it so that this is less true. So number one, Konami seems intent on printing many, many, many one-card starters, and like I mentioned at the outset of the video, a lot of these don't even require the normal summon. And if they're going to continue printing cards in this fashion, particularly printing starters that don't require the normal summon, the efficacy of Ash as a reactive card is going to continue to drop kind of precipitously. And that, to me, will mean that you are now pushing Ash into being used in its second way, which is as a proactive card. So the other way that Ash Blossom obviously gets used is to counter Maxi, is to counter the Mulcharmies. And if Ash just exists as Crossout Designator 2, 3, and 4, or Called by the Grave 2, 3, and 4, then I think we're probably living in a world where that's a little bit more problematic. And it's exerting the wrong type of metagame pressure. Because the reality is, like I said, I do feel like the Charmies for now need to exist. There are a bunch of arguments, I think, to be made about like what could go. Should it be the Charmies that go? Should we get rid of the degenerate decks that make the Charmies required? Is that really a viable thing to do? I can't answer all those questions in this video today. We don't have 2 hours. Maybe we'll do it sometime. I'll get like a coffee and we'll do a 2-hour recording session. But we're not going to answer that question today. But I think that if you're living in a world where you are working under the assumption that Charmies are important, then Ash Blossom becomes an increasingly challenging card to justify. It's notable that the OCG recently semi-limited Ash Blossom down to 2. I will say, as an aside, that I think the semi-limit number is one of the strangest ones in Yu-Gi-Oh's existence. Like, I understand why limiting is good, and limiting is something that we do in Magic as well all the time. In exactly Vintage, we don't do it in other formats, but limiting something makes sense. You want to make sure there's only one of them in the deck. Maybe if it's a recurable effect that a deck could tutor for or something like that, it makes sense that, you make it so that they get to search it once, they use it, but then if the game goes longer, they don't get to search it and use it again. Sure, fine. Makes sense. And in the same light, like cross out and called by the grave are at one because you only want that effect to happen one time. Sure, whatever. Like I can see it. But two seems like a weird number. Two is like, okay, we want to make it so that you're getting Ash Blossomed less, but at the same time, it just like kind of spikes the negative variance feelings when you do get Ash Blossomed. It just seems a bit strange to me. And I think that that's actually kind of an interesting point as well, but maybe we'll talk about it as well. So the other thing about Ash Blossom as a proactive card, and this is the other part of the discourse that I've seen come up quite a lot, is it's frustrating when the person going first has an Ash Blossom. They you don't have a Charmy, so they don't have to Ash Blossom your Charmy. Then they build their board through whatever hand traps you do have. And then in addition to needing to play through what's on their board, you also have to play through the Ash Blossom that they have in hand. And when they have the Ash Blossom backed up with an already established end board, that can oftentimes push Ash over the edge into feeling too powerful. And I think that this is also a pretty valid and good point. I talked about Force of Will, and I talked about the times when Force of Will has felt too good have been when it has been usable as a card to defend combos, and that's definitely true. The spots where Force of Will has felt the most frustrating has been when it's been protecting wins, and those wins have been too easy to set up. And that's kind of what's happening in a lot of these Yu-Gi-Oh games, right? Because Yu-Gi-Oh games are so short, if you are able to blank your opponent's turn once, your end board is going to win the game if you went first, right? So it's not quite like a combo kill in the sense that it would be in a Magic context, like a sneak and show combo kill or something like that, but it is analogous, and I do think that you can make that comparison. So overall, how do we feel about Ash Blossom? What is the purpose of this card existing? Do they need to re-template Ash Blossom, like create a new one that has more of the charmy Dominus Impulse type text where it's mostly only usable as a reactive card going second and doesn't have the same kind of efficacy if you draw it going first? I think where I would land is that until they print something that is like that, I think you have to leave Ash legal because of its use as a reactive card. The applications on the proactive side are really frustrating, and I think that when it's countering Charmies or when it's being used as a follow-up to your already powerful end board, obviously exceptionally frustrating and does not always lead to the most positive play experiences. But I think that at least for now, there need to be cards that are acceptable to put in your main deck that make it so that the variance behind losing the die roll is less exacerbated. If you just like couldn't play this card, I do think that it ultimately does just make going second worse, even though it also weakens going first. Like I'm not suggesting that Ash doesn't also make going first worse, or doesn't also make going first better. It certainly does. If you open it in your opening hand, it can a lot of the time be powerful. But I think that's where I land, is that you got to leave it for now. That the metagame pressure it exerts is for now fine. Emphasis on fine, but that in the long term, if more acceptable hand traps were printed that were maybe templated in a better way to make them more reasonable for the player going second and worse for the player going first, I would certainly support changes to the number of Ash Blossoms that were legal once that happened. And I would just ban it, by the way. I wouldn't restrict it, or I wouldn't limit it or semi-limit it. I think if you printed an acceptable replacement, I would say let's just get rid of this. Let's not put it at one and have it be called by the grave part 2 / sometimes an interactive hand trap. So that's all I've got for today. That's metagame pressure. That's Ash Blossom, contentious subject. Would love to hear your thoughts about it in the comments. I'm sure I will, which like I said, I really enjoy. I hope you enjoyed the video today. I hope you enjoyed Mabel's cameo. I was going to hold her up to the camera, but she left. You'll probably have seen me grimace in pain as she dug her claws into my leg to try and get up. But yeah, that's all I've got for today. I hope you subscribe if you stayed all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.